Episode 23, Chapter 21. Chapter 21.
Don't forget the Bolson construction naming conventions, Hudson said as he looked up at Link, who sat atop Spirit. I'm sure you'll find a Goron that meets those requirements.
Link, for his part, was not very sure of that at all, but he nodded in agreement to Hudson.
If I find anyone, I'll tell them all about Tari Town,
he said, smiling wryly. Behind Hudson, the construction workers already started working again. They woke with the first rays of sunlight, ate a quick breakfast of salted fish, and got right to it. One of them, Matheson was his name, Link thought, predicted rain later in the day, which sent the crew into a kind of working frenzy. He was, apparently, never wrong about this sort of thing.
Thanks, Link.
Hudson smiled at Link from beneath his bushy mustache.
You know, I thought you were pretty strange back in Hoteno Village. But now I see you're a pretty good guy.
Thanks, I guess. Link thought. Verbally, he said,
Well, great. Good luck with Tari Town. I'll make sure to stop by when I visit the area again.
He leaned down a moment later, grasping Hudson's outstretched hand, shaking it briefly before sitting back up and clicking his tongue, urging Spirit into a slow walk across the bridge. Once free of the bridge, he rejoined the old road, turning south and beginning the climb back up the hill. As he climbed, he looked back over at the small town in its infancy. As strange as the men founding it were, it lifted his heart to see. As far as he had seen, the only new settlement created since the fall of Hyrule had been New Kashuto, and that town had been founded by the families of the soldiers that fought and died at the citadel. It was a town founded in tragedy by refugees. This new town, though Link knew that it couldn't be called one just yet, was something else. Founded, not off of tragedy or even necessity, but out of hope. A wealthy Hylian's hope for new riches and Bolson's hope for renown, true, but hope, all the same. It seemed a good omen for Link as he continued on his journey to Death Mountain and the divine beast for Rudania. Matheson's predictions came true by midday as a blustery rain blew in from the west, accompanied by strong winds. As Link made his way across a bridge, leading Spirit by the reins on foot, the rain wall hit, immediately soaking him through. Having begun to grow used to getting rained on while traveling by now, Link donned his cloak, cinching the collar tight, and raising his hood. It did little to keep him dry, however, as the bridge passed close by a waterfall originating from Zora's domain that sprayed him with mist, in addition to the rain falling from the sky. The rain did not abate until after he eventually made camp a few hours later, after trudging across the series of bridges that spanned the South Lake Akala and Akala Falls. When he finally did decide to rest for the night, he managed to find a small overhang in the cliffs surrounding Zora's domain, where he was able to huddle up in. Unable to find any dry wood, he was forced to go without a fire that evening, but that served him just fine. The cleft in the rock that he had found was right across from the old Akala parade ground. As the sun set, he kept his eyes on the towering citadel, watching for any signs of the remaining guardian he knew was still active up there. To his dismay, he did eventually see the flying guardian that still circled the structure, but it was not alone. As darkness fell over the land, the colored lights on the guardians' bodies became more pronounced, revealing to Link that at least two of the six-legged walking guardians remaining active up there as well, stalking around the fortress like they were on patrol. It made his stomach twist in fear and anticipation. None of them ever appeared to notice his small, huddled form so far away, but regardless, he was grateful to mount Spirit again the next morning and make his way away from the citadel. The overcast sky overhead promised more rain. Spring in Hyrule, it seemed, was a very wet season, indeed. Later the next day, he approached the fork in the road that led up towards Death Mountain. Gratefully, he patted Spirit's neck, whispering his thanks for the horse's perseverance. It had rained again, several times, as the morning transitioned into the afternoon. They still had plenty more to traverse before the day was up, but he felt that this would be as good a place as any to rest for a time. He dismounted off Spirit's back, grimacing at the soreness that had already begun to set back into his legs. His wet clothes hadn't helped any, leaving Link able to feel the multitude of places that were chafing underneath his tunic and trousers.
It's just a wonderful day, he said, removing the cloak from his shoulders and draping it over a low-hanging tree branch. After a moment of hesitation and glancing around at the roads to the north and west, he removed his tunic as well, twisting it tightly in an attempt to wring the water out of it. Honestly, Spirit, I can't imagine a better couple of days for travel. Spirit responded by snorting and bending down to eat a tuft of grass. Right. Good idea.
Link removed his sodden boots and socks and began to walk around, looking for the means to make a small fire. It would be nice to try to dry off some before getting back on the road. Unfortunately, the rain appeared to have fallen here just as heavily as it had in the Akala Highlands, and it hadn't been clear or warm enough to dry anything enough to make use of. The day had warmed enough, though, that Link didn't feel terribly chilly, even bare-chested as he was. After eating a small meal, he removed his sword from the saddle, unsheathing this silver Zora weapon and admiring its surface. This, at least, seemed perfectly fine with the wet weather he had been experiencing. He imagined that it would have to be completely impervious to rust and water damage, considering where it had originated from. He walked over to a small clearing away from the road and where Spirit was grazing. Once there, he took up a swordsman's stance, smiling as his body naturally responded. It knew exactly what to do, even if his own memories of learning such things were non-existent. As he began to go through the motions of the forgotten kata, he found his worries of the day fading away. His mind felt clearer than it had since speaking with Princess Zelda 2 nights prior, allowing him to reflect from a more detached perspective. He supposed that speaking with the princess as he had should have brought him some peace and comfort, but it had only left him feeling more conflicted, highlighting the gulf that separated them now, both in body and mind. It was clear to him how dedicated he had been when they traveled together. He had been passionate about his duties as her protector. Though he had few memories of those times now, his heart still remembered that dedication and respect he had for her. There was, of course, something else. He would be foolish to deny that he had felt something more for Princess Zelda than just duty and dedication alone. His memory of the Spring of Power provided plenty of evidence for that alone. They had been friends, and Link thought that there could have been more that he felt towards her. He supposed it wouldn't surprise him if he found out that he once had feelings for the princess. She was a beautiful woman, indeed. They had traveled together, too. Seemingly alone. The thought made him feel suddenly flush, and he renewed his efforts to engage with his kata, swinging the sword in a variety of single and double-handed flourishes. A light sweat broke out on his forehead, plastering a few loose strands of hair to his face. The light breeze that blew across him felt pleasantly cool. It was strange to him, the way he was reliving his memories. When he saw them, he did not see them through the eyes of an outsider, but from his own perspective. Yet once removed, it felt like he was reading a book with the pages scrambled. He had little context for any of these things. He knew things that he directly reflected on in the memory. There were 3 springs. The Spring of Power, the Spring of Courage, and another spring. He only knew of the location of the Spring of Power, though he distinctly recalled thinking of their time at the Spring of Courage during his memory. It was frustrating. Even the fragments of memory that he saw contained fragments of other memories, leaving tantalizing hints at previous experiences with no way to follow those teases to their conclusion. Even his memories of Mipha and Zora's domain were woefully fragmented, though his time there had certainly helped him piece some of them together to form a larger picture. He set his jaw, beginning to move faster than before, grunting with the exertion of his swings and thrusts. Part of his mind raged at the injustice of it all. He was no naive child. Even without his memories, he knew that good would not, could not, always prevail over evil like in children's tales. Yet this still felt so wrong. They were not supposed to have failed in the way they did. And whose fault was it? He wouldn't believe that it had been Princess Zelda's. Not after what he had witnessed in the Spring of Power. Had it, then, been his? Had he not attained what he was supposed to attain, the Master Sword? And his skills with the blade were apparent, even 100 years later. So then who? Whose fault could it? A woman yelped in terror, breaking Link's concentration. He grew aware of his surroundings again. The clouds overhead had broken in places, giving way to shafts of golden light that brought out the color of the grass and trees. His body was covered in a layer of sweat from head to toe. And there was a woman in filthy traveler's garb sitting on the ground in front of him, a look of fear in her eyes. Blinking in confusion, Link stepped back, glancing briefly at his sword. He hadn't no. His sword bore no blood, and the woman didn't immediately show any signs of being wounded. How had she approached without his notice? Had he been so focused that he had shut out the world around him so completely?
I'm sorry, I was distracted. Are you all right?
Link turned the sword over, sinking it into the wet earth point down, and stepped forward, holding his hand out to help the woman to her feet. The woman looked up at him with some fear, eyes darting from his face to his extended hand.
I tried calling out to you, but you wouldn't answer me. I thought that maybe you just didn't hear me, but even when I stood right in front of you.
Link grimaced, feeling his face flush.
I was very distracted, it seems. I'm sorry if I scared you. I was lost in my thoughts. I hope you are not hurt. Not by you, no, she said before, finally, accepting his outstretched hand and allowing him to pull her to her feet. Link noticed immediately that she was favoring one leg, and he frowned. You're sure? Yes, The woman grimaced and looked down at her own feet. I was traveling on the road when a nearby lightning strike spooked my horse. She threw me and bolted. I think that I must have sprained my ankle when I fell. Sprained your ankle? Link asked, thinking of the healing abilities given to him by Mitha. Do you need me to look at it? Maybe there is something I can. Oh, no, sir. The woman said quickly, eyes widening. She hobbled a step back from him, hands up. It's quite all right. I only came over because you are the first traveler that I've seen on the road for the last 2 days. I have been trying to make my way up towards the trader's outpost at the foot of Death Mountain, but it has been slow moving because of my ankle. I had hoped that you might be going in that direction. She was a clearly skittish woman, but Link could hardly blame her. With a sudden flash of embarrassment, he thought of how he might look. He had been swinging his sword around like, well, a trained killer, nearly taking her head off in the process. To make matters worse, he had taken off his tunic, leaving his multitude of scars visible for the woman to see. It must have taken a great deal of courage for her to even approach her. He had seen no sign of her presence when he arrived in the area. You are in luck, he said, trying to keep his voice as calming as possible. That is exactly where I am headed. I will be happy to help you get there. Really? Her shoulders slumped in relief. Thank the goddess. I did not know what I would do if you chose to pass me by. Slowly, Link moved past her, trying to keep his movements from anything that might appear threatening. He felt dread in the pit of his stomach. He did not want to imagine what could have happened to this woman if she had approached someone else. He reached up and pulled his tunic from the tree branch, slipping it back on over his head. When he looked back at her, she inspected the tunic with a curious expression. Such color. I imagine that you must have had that dyed in Hoteno village, she said. Link glanced down at himself, and the blue champion's tunic that he had chosen to wear that day. It was a gift, actually, but I imagine that's where the person that made it could have gotten the fabric. It is very nice, the woman said. Link looked back to her, smiling slightly. She was a pretty enough woman. With auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail and faint freckles on her cheeks, she looked like she might have been close to Zelda's age from his memories. She was dressed in a simple blouse and a pair of trousers, though her clothes were very muddy, likely from sleeping on the ground during the last couple rainy days. Thanks, he said before pulling his cloak from the tree branch. Are you hungry or anything? I still have some food left over. The woman patted a small pouch that she had slung over her shoulders. He supposed that she must have been wearing it when she was thrown off her horse. I've been able to eat, at least. Good. After a moment, Link cleared his throat. I am Link, by the way. The woman smiled warmly at this and stepped forward, still favoring her hurt ankle, holding her hand out to him. I am Delilah. It is so nice to meet you, Link. He shook her hand, noting the strength of her grip and that her fingers seemed calloused. She clearly works hard with her hands, he thought. After shaking hands, he motioned towards Spirit. I imagine you're eager to get off that ankle of yours. Do you need me to help you up? That would be most appreciated, thank you. I don't know if I could do so easily with my ankle the way it is. Link approached her, allowing her to place an arm over his shoulder, and helped her hobble over to Spirit, who stood not far away. Once there, he held her injured leg steady and lifted her up, allowing her vault her other leg over the saddle. When she was seated, he adjusted the stirrups and helped her slip her injured foot into one. How is that? He asked when he stepped back from her. Comfortable? Yes, thank you, she said, smiling warmly down at him. A moment later, she frowned. But what about you? I don't want to force you to walk the whole way. I'm sure we both could fit, if needed. Link felt a sudden heat rise up his neck and shook his head. No, I'm all right. Spirit would probably appreciate having someone lighter than me on his back, anyway. He's been ridden pretty hard these last few weeks. I can walk. If you're sure. I'd just hate for you to have to walk so far. It's not a problem. Link sat down in the grass, pulling back on his socks and boots, which were still damp. With some irritation, he noticed that one of his socks now had a hole in it, allowing his big toe to poke out. Sighing, he pulled his boot on over that foot and laced it up. When he stood up,
He couldn't help but to think that, yes, the walk would be uncomfortable, with how damp his clothes and boots were, but there was nothing to do about it. Such a long ride with the two of them sharing the saddle would be just as uncomfortable, as far as Link was concerned. He stepped up to the horse.
"Excuse me, I just want to get this."
He untied his sheath from the saddle, careful not to accidentally touch Delilah's legs in the process. His earlier thoughts of traveling alone with Princess Zelda had put him in a poor mindset altogether, and he scolded himself. Still, it might be nice to have someone to talk to, if only for the rest of the day. Something to keep him from dwelling on his thoughts of the past.
"That is a very nice sword,"
Delilah said as he strapped the scabbard to his back and then retrieved the sword. Link used the grass to wipe off any mud that clung to the blade after being stuck into the ground, and then sheathed the sword.
"It, too, was a gift,"
Link said, smiling wryly.
"In fact, just about everything I have with me was a gift, one way or another." "It sounds like you have generous friends,"
she said, eyebrows raised.
"Something like that." "What is that on your hip? Another gift?"
She pointed at the Sheikah slate that Link still wore.
"Oh, this."
Link reached down, running his fingers along the Sheikah slate's cool surface.
"It's just something that I'm holding onto for a friend of mine."
He wasn't sure why, but he suddenly found that he didn't want to answer any questions about it. He reached forward, taking Spirit's reins and gently pulling the horse around so that he was facing uphill.
"If you don't mind my asking, why were you traveling alone, anyway?"
Link asked as they began to walk up the muddy dirt road. He had left the brick roads behind as he left the Akala Highlands.
"I was under the impression that these roads can be dangerous." "Aren't you traveling alone?"
Delilah asked, curious.
"Well, I'm armed."
Link smiled back at her, patting the sword hilt over his shoulder.
"I have some family that live up at the outpost. I was hoping to spend some time with them,"
she said, looking a little embarrassed now.
"To be honest, I assumed that I would just be able to outrun anything I came across on my horse." "Some of the monsters around here have horses of their own,"
Link said, his eyes meeting Spirit's. He patted the horse on the nose fondly.
"Where did you travel from?" "Hateno village."
Link looked back at her, eyebrows raised.
"Really? I just purchased a home there. I don't remember ever seeing you around the town, though."
He saw a flash of uncertainty cross her eyes at this, though it disappeared quickly.
"My family are farmers. We don't travel into town very often, unless we're purchasing supplies. I haven't really spent a lot of time there, anyway. I've been doing a lot of traveling. I purchased the home more to keep some of my things, instead of making poor Spirit carry everything that I don't immediately need." "Why are you traveling so much? You came from Akala, didn't you?"
Link flushed a little at the question, still not really sure what he should say to questions such as these. He didn't like the idea of everybody knowing his true mission.
"I'm a traveling researcher,"
he finally said, lamely.
"Oh? What are you researching?" "Guardians."
Link paused for a moment, wincing a little as he looked away from her. He probably should have chosen something like the Sheikah shrines. At least he had some inkling of what those were really like.
"I'd heard that there were some functioning ones still in the Akala Highlands." "Were there?"
He glanced back and saw that Delilah had leaned forward in the saddle, showing a great deal of interest in Link's words. He felt a slight flush creep up his neck again.
"A few,"
he said, thinking back to those he saw on and around the citadel.
"I didn't want to approach too close, lest they decide to attack me. They sound scary, from the stories I've heard. I've never seen one from up close, though."
Link frowned slightly, looking away from her. That seemed odd to him for some reason. But before he could think about it any further, she continued speaking.
"My grandfather once said that he saw them when they attacked the castle."
He grimaced at thought. What terror the people of Hyrule must have experienced when the Guardians, creations made to protect them, turned and attacked. The familiar sense of shame fell onto his shoulders like a heavy weight. If only things had happened differently. If only they had been more prepared.
"You don't seem much how I would imagine a traveling researcher to be, though,"
Delilah said.
"How do you imagine a traveling researcher should look?" "I don't know."
She sat back up straighter in the saddle, looking up thoughtfully.
"Older, I suppose. Scrawnier." "I'm a little older than I look,"
Link said, chuckling softly.
"But you're not scrawny. You look like you've seen a lot of battles, actually. Researching guardians can be pretty dangerous work, if you aren't careful. And I have a tendency of walking into trouble.
He looked forward again, but he could still feel Delilah's eyes on him from behind. Thankfully, she did not press any further with her questions, and soon the conversation turned to less personal matters that didn't require Link to outright lie. Together, he and Delilah traveled up the road for a couple more hours before she asked if they could stop. The sun was beginning to set in the west, and they were still a couple of hours from the outpost, at least. Traveling together slowed their pace, as Link was forced to walk, and Spirit began to show signs of tiring. Link noticed, though, that the land around them was beginning to show subtle signs of change. The color of the grass had shifted from a verdant green to a paler color with shades of yellow. The dirt had begun to show a hint of red. They were nearing the base of the volcanic mountain range.
Are you doing all right? Is it your ankle?
Link asked as he slowed Spirit to a stop, looking back at her.
No. Well, yes, a bit. It's aching a lot. I'm also getting very tired. Would this be a good place to stop for the night?
Link frowned slightly, looking back up the hill.
We aren't too far from the trader's outpost now. Are you sure you wouldn't like to keep going? It's maybe another couple of hours up the road. My ankle is just really sore after so much riding. Riding like this has me feeling sore, too.
He grimaced slightly, thinking that her choices for riding would be to put pressure on her ankle to relieve herself from the constant bouncing of the saddle, or to just endure a sore backside. It sounded to him like she ended up with both.
Yeah, of course. Here.
He said, walking over to the side of the saddle.
I'll help you down.
Delilah smiled gratefully down at him and leaned over, placing her hands on his shoulders. After a moment of embarrassed hesitation, Link carefully placed his hands to either side of her hips, helping her off of the horse and setting her down onto the ground. Once she was firmly on the ground, he quickly released her hips and turned so that she could wrap an arm around his shoulder again.
Thank you so much for all of your help,
she said as he helped her walk over to a small grassy mound, where he helped her sit.
I know that I've probably slowed you down terribly. It's really all right. I just wish we had seen your horse out here somewhere.
Link stood back up, turning back to Spirit and beginning to pull his saddlebags free.
I'm glad that you have family to stay with when we get there. Are they expecting you? They knew I would try to come stay with them in the spring, but we didn't discuss any other time frame than that.
Delilah gently rubbed her ankle through the leather of her boots. He thought that she would probably feel better if she removed them but didn't voice his thoughts.
Would it be better if I rode ahead and retrieved one of them? Maybe they could bring a wagon or something to help carry you. That way, you wouldn't have to spend another night outside.
She smiled up at Link and shook her head.
One more night won't hurt me. Besides, I don't mind the company.
Link felt his cheeks grow warm. When he had first met her, she had seemed like a very shy girl, but she had gained confidence as they spoke throughout the day and grew comfortable in each other's presence. And he had to admit to himself that he found her to be attractive. She was no blonde princess with green eyes, true, but she had a different kind of prettiness to her. He thought that she might have a similar attraction to him from some of the things she had said. Not that he had any intent on taking that mutual attraction anywhere. He had far more important things to worry about than a pretty face.
If you're sure,
he said after recovering his wits about him.
I'll see if I can gather some supplies for a fire. With any luck, maybe I can catch some fresh meat as well.
After he knew for sure that she was comfortable, he grabbed his bow and arrows from Spirit's saddle, setting off down the hill, to where the trees had been thicker. When he later returned carrying a rabbit by its ears with one hand, and a bundle of sticks under his other arm, he found Delilah where he had left her. She had pulled a brush from her small pack and used it to delicately brush out the tangles in her hair, which she had pulled free of her ponytail. Link froze and, for a moment, did not see Delilah at all. Instead, he saw Princess Zelda, seated upon a tree stump, dressed in her travel clothes, brushing her hair with a silver hairbrush. But he did not just see her on a stump. No, he also saw her on a rock, seated on the bare ground, on horseback, on a sandy beach. All at once, he saw images flash through his head of the princess brushing her hair in a dozen different positions, wearing a dozen different outfits. It had been a nightly ritual of hers.
Link?
Zelda asked, looking up at him curiously. Blinking rapidly, Link dispelled the images, taking a deep breath. When he opened his eyes again, the images of Princess Zelda had faded, replaced by the single image of Delilah, looking at him with a concerned expression. It hadn't been the princess who had spoken.
"Oh, sorry, distracted."
Link cleared his throat, trying to hide the sudden uncomfortable urge he got to be away from this woman who, for the briefest of moments, brought images of his princess to his mind.
"You get distracted a lot,"
she said, slipping her hairbrush back into her pack. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flash of white in the pack, but it had been too quick for him to see any kind of detail.
"You need to be more careful, or it will be the death of you one day." "I'll take that under advisement,"
he said, a little more gruffly than he meant to. He set the wood down on the ground, placing the dead rabbit down next to him.
"Poor little guy,"
Delilah said, looking at the rabbit.
"He had no idea what was coming." "I'd be a poor hunter, if he did,"
Link said, trying to inject some humor back into his tone. She didn't deserve for him to get moody around her just because she had been brushing her hair.
"That's true."
She watched him as he assembled the bundles of sticks into a small stack before he took out his belt knife and began to shave pieces of bark off to be used for kindling.
"I can skin the rabbit, if you would like,"
she offered after a few minutes of watching him prepare the fire. He handed the dead rabbit over, along with his knife, and she went to work while he set about starting the fire with a rock and a piece of flint. When he was completely finished, he looked with some satisfaction at the small, but healthy fire that he had been able to get started. Delilah proved very adept at skinning the rabbit, as well, her cuts delicate so as to preserve the animal's pelt. That was good. Link might be able to trade it for a few rupees in the outpost. He did not have many rupees left to his name at this point, and Pura had not been willing to part with any more after he convinced her to buy his house for him. He supposed that he would probably split whatever amount he sold the rabbit for with Delilah, though. By the time she had finished, he had set up a small stand for his cookpot using leftover wood and stones to lift it off the fire. He took over the cooking, cutting the rabbit meat up and combining it with other vegetables and herbs he had or had foraged.
"Wow,"
Delilah said as she watched him prod the meat with a wooden spoon.
"I hadn't expected that you would be so adept at cooking as well."
Link glanced up at her and smiled, shrugging his shoulders.
"Just something I picked up, I suppose."
She hummed a response, and Link looked back down at the pan, satisfied with how everything looking. He carefully removed it from the fire, setting it down on a flat stone that he had carried over. Once satisfied, he held the wooden spoon out to her.
"I don't really have any plates or utensils,"
he explained at her questioning look. She took the spoon and he took the knife, wiping it before letting the fire burn off any excess blood from the blade before using it to spear a chunk of rabbit. They ate in silence for a time. Link was mostly satisfied with the dinner, but he felt like something was missing, though he just couldn't place a finger on it. He felt certain, though, that whatever it was must have been locked behind a memory that he hadn't regained. Delilah, it appeared, agreed with him, as she fished in her pack after finishing their meal and pulled out a pair of ripe bananas, holding one out to Link. After their supper, Link laid out his own bedroll for her to use, finding her a spot of soft grass before backing away to the other side of the fire, where he had laid out his cloak, which had, gratefully, dried by the warm fire.
"You've been incredibly sweet to me, Link,"
Delilah said as she watched him clean up and prepare for bed.
"You didn't have to do any of this at all." "What should I have done?" "Made you go get your own,"
he said, looking up at her with a wry smile.
"Regardless, I do not think I will ever forget the kindness you showed me."
Link couldn't quite read her expression in the flickering firelight, so he merely shrugged again.
"I couldn't very well leave someone in need. That's why I'm so glad that I found you."
He could see her smile from beyond the fire before she lied down, curling up in his bedroll. Link watched her as she settled for a time before lying down himself, wrapping his cloak around him, and soon falling asleep.
"Open your eyes."
She appeared before him, resplendent in her white dress. Her green eyes were like emeralds. Her blonde hair shone with the sun. He couldn't but to smile at the sight of her. It was nice to see her again.
"Open your eyes."
She was saying something to him, but it seemed distant. Hard to make out. It sounded as though he were underwater. He shook his head to try to tell her that he couldn't understand her, still smiling.
"Open your eyes."
He frowned now. Her expression had come into greater clarity, she looked terrified. Her eyes were wide, lips forming her frantic words. Now Link heard her.
Open your eyes, Link. Wake up.
Link's eyes opened with a jolt. Standing directly over him was a dark figure in a white mask with an inverted Sheikah eye emblazoned on its face. End of chapter.